We're continuing the materials with the law of journalism and mass communication in Chapter 4, dealing with libel and with emotional distress. And we're going to be getting into the concept of fault. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the landmark case, New York Times versus Sulivan, which is a civil rights case from the 1960s dealing with libel. It actually sets the standard dealing with fault and sets the standard for public officials. So there's in the textbook on page 163 some discussion of that, and there's an excerpt at the end of the chapter from the case and from the majority opinion. And I had also given to you the summary from Wikipedia to sort of give you some sort of context with that. So this advertorial, this advertisement editorial gets published in the New York Times by civil rights leaders making charges against public officials down in southern states who are using illegal methods and violent methods to suppress civil rights marches that are going on at the time. So the lead defendant is I.B. Sulivan, who's the police commissioner over in Montgomery, Alabama, and he sues for $500,000 in damages against the Times. That's even though he is not specifically identified by name. He is stating that it is of and concerning him. And this criticism that's leveled against public officials, specifically against him. Essentially, they're using, at the time, the lawsuit in order to try and stop public criticism. In the book, they actually have the excerpt from the opinion at the end of the chapter, as well as a discussion on page 165 from this editorial / advertisement. And this lawsuit is being used to suppress freedom of speech and to punish criticism of the government. So the court, in reviewing this, set the standard of actual malice. Actual malice goes towards intent or intentionally producing or publishing information that is false, or publishing it with reckless disregard where they knew or should have known that that information was false. So it changes the standard from simple negligence, and it makes it more difficult for public officials because they have to prove that the defendant had that intent. So the level of fault now is higher when dealing with public officials. And again, that goes towards the value placed on the First Amendment and debate on public issues, which should be open and uninhibited. The debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. It may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. The court also held that journalists need to have breathing space, and freedom of speech is protected in the Constitution, and that allows protection against lawsuits such as this, where libel is being used to suppress that speech. This standard applies to public officials, so that's where you have to show that there was intent or reckless disregard in order to show actual malice. That's going to bring me back to the discussion that we had in an earlier chapter where we were talking about levels of fault. We were talking about different types of torts. So if you take a look on page 177 in the textbook, they talk about different types of torts. Here's a breakdown, and I'm going to put all of these up on the page. So intentional torts, negligence, and strict liability. Intentional torts is where somebody acts intentionally or they act with reckless disregard for the consequences of others. So either they intended the consequences, well, they intended the actions that they took. So they either intended to take the actions that they took. They may or may not have known the consequences and how that was going to result, or they acted without regard, with indifference towards the consequences towards others. Where in the case of making statements, there's no due diligence, and they knew or should have known that the statements were false, that can be attributed to intent. Using that analysis is sometimes harder, because in order to prove that, you have to be able to demonstrate what was going on in the mind of the defendant. No one is a mind reader, so you have to be able to demonstrate from the actions of the person what their mindset was. Maybe you have something that's been published that has statements showing what their intent was, or maybe there are actions that they've taken that demonstrate what was going on in their minds. The second standard for review of torts, or where somebody's reputation has been injured with libel, is negligence. That's where you can't necessarily show intent, but someone has been damaged, and there was a duty that the journalist or the publisher was supposed to uphold, where they weren't supposed to publish something that was false, and there was a breach of that duty, and then there was a connection, the causation, and damage resulted from that. The third standard is strict liability, and that's no fault liability, where the defendant would be liable if there was any damage at all. Those are the three standards for review for damage to reputation: intentional torts, negligence, strict liability. So again, depending on who is involved as the plaintiff, there can be a different standard. If you have a public official, you're going to be looking at intentional torts. If you have a private individual, you're going to be looking at negligence as the standard. So with public officials and public figures, that standard is actual malice, showing intent. So there's knowledge of falsity, or where they knew that it was false, or there's a reckless disregard for the truth, which is should have known. They should have done their due diligence in order to check. Public officials are defined as people who have a significant role in the business of government and public affairs, and then you've got public figures who have put themselves out into the public eye, so they got pervasive fame or notoriety, or somebody who enters into the public eye because of some public issue that is going on or some controversy. Private individuals, that's a little bit different. Again, that is the negligence standard, and there's a duty of reasonable care or duty of ordinary care in doing the research and in publishing to make sure that the facts are true, and then there's a failure to do that. So with the first one, again, with public officials, plaintiff has to show the intent, that they knew that there was, these were false statements. And with private individuals, they have to show lack of care. So you get the courts trying to define out the differences between public officials and public individuals and private individuals. So public figures, courts divide that up into all-purpose and limited purpose. So all-purpose, they're people who occupy positions, they're pervasively out there in the public eye, then they have power and influence. And then limited purpose, for a particular public controversy. They're in the public eye, but they're trying to resolve that particular problem in that set of circumstances. The textbook makes reference to this in the Gertz case on page 173, and again, that's dealing more with the distinctions between an all-purpose public figure and then a limited-purpose public figure. So with these standards, the courts also tried to distinguish with these public and private figures and the limited-purpose figures the concept of bootstrapping, where the standard of review cannot be pushed up to the higher level of actual malice, where intent has to be shown in situations where you've got a private individual who is suddenly put into the public eye, and that's from the news media, and then the news media gets to use that higher standard because they're in the public eye. That's an unfair situation for private individuals. The idea behind that is that public officials or people who put themselves into the public eye have access to those resources where they're going to have the ability to correct any false information. They're going to have the opportunity to rebut or to make changes to information that was put out there, whereas a private individual doesn't have that access, doesn't have that influence, doesn't have that kind of power. So it winds up where it's not fair to bump that standard up for private individual. So again, that's the whole concept of bootstrapping. You can't create a situation that puts some private individual into the public eye and then say, oh, that higher standard applies. All right, just briefly, a limited purpose public figure checklist. They have to step into the spotlight voluntarily. They have to be playing a role in the resolution of an important public or societal controversy, and they have access to the media. They try to influence public opinion in the resolution of that issue, in trying to figure out whether this is a all-purpose or limited-purpose public figure. Certain factors that they can take a look at, such as the community that they're in, whether it's national, regional, or local, how long this event is going on for, so the duration of that, what their field of expertise is, and other factors. So that deals with public figures, the all-purpose and limited purpose, and they are again held to that standard of intent with actual malice. For private figures, you're using the negligence standard, and that goes towards an ordinary standard of care or reasonable standard of care, where the journalists have to follow through in collecting of information and do more than just pass along rumors. There's actually a decent short list on pages 176 and 177 that I put into the slides here that you can take a look at, that essentially go to standards of care where you're not doing sloppy journalism. So again, with private figures, they do not have to show intent, they don't have to show actual malice. Just that there's a certain standard that needs to be followed, certain actions that should be taken, and that the journalist did not follow that standard.